Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my tutorials. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to set up a grapple hook. So this is kind of what it looks like. You basically just press a button and it fires off the grapple hook, and then it pulls you towards that location. So I was kind of inspired by Halo 5's grappling hook. I didn't actually get to play Halo 5 yet. I was just watching some people play it on Twitch, and so I tried to kind of mimic that to some degree. So it's physics based in the sense of like it's adding to your velocity each frame, and so you can kind of have some air control with it too. So if I hold left here, you can see I don't exactly go right towards it, and so then once I get past it, it disconnects, and I can fire it as much as I want. If I fire it at something and it doesn't hit anything, it will just delete basically, and then I can also delete it. Or I can also like cancel it in the middle. So if I fire and I hit cancel, it will quit out of it before I actually get there. So that's pretty much how it works. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I'm going to open up the Epic Game Launcher because we're going to be doing this from scratch. And then I'm using Unreal Engine 5, the early access version. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And then while that's happening, let me just move this over here. All right, so we're going to select games, and then we want to do the first person templates, and then make sure you have blueprint selected. And I'm just going to call this Grapple Hook Tutorial, and then go ahead and create the project. And then I'll wait for a second for this to go up. All right, let's close these guys. All right, so the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to come back to the content folder and then right click and make a new folder. And we're just going to call this Grapple Hook. And so inside of here is where we're going to put all of our grapple hook code. All right, so let me open this up. Let me move my mic real quick. All right, sorry about that. So inside of here, let's first create the grapple hook component. And the reason I'm making it a component is mostly just so the code can be self-contained inside of its own blueprint. And then also, if you want to use this grappling hook for maybe AI in your game or some other character in your game, you could do that relatively easily since it's inside of a component. So we're going to right click and then go to blueprint class and then select actor component. And then we're going to call this the grapple component. And then we're also going to need a few more things while we're here. We're also going to need the state of the grappling hook, and we're going to keep that stored in an enum. So let's go ahead and create one of those. So right click, blueprint class, enumeration, and we're going to call this E for enumeration, grapple state. And so let's open this guy up, and then we're going to add 3 enum values to this. So hit the new button 3 times. And so the first state is going to be ready to fire. So this is essentially, or the grapple will be in this state whenever it is not currently fired, thus ready to be fired. And then we're also going to have one for firing, which is when the grappling hook is being fired through the air. And then the last one is going to be called attached to target. So this is when the grappling hook actually hits something, and then the player starts getting pulled towards the target. So those are the 3 different states. So we'll just save that, and then we can close this, so we don't need it anymore. And then the next one we want is the grappling hook itself, which is going to be the end of the grappling line, and that's going to be the thing that actually does the collision to see what we hit. So right click, make a new blueprint class, and this is just going to be a type actor, and we'll call it BP underscore grapple hook. And then we just need 2 more things. So the first thing we need is an actual static mesh for the grappling hook, because you'll notice here in my other project, let me just run this real quick. You'll notice when I shoot it, there's a little white sphere at the end. Maybe it's easier if I shoot it at a wall. So you can see that little white sphere at the end. So that's the actual grappling hook. And then the cable itself is going to be a different actor. But we need to have a static mesh for the grappling hook. And then since this is just a tutorial so you guys can follow along, I'm just going to use a sphere. But if you want to swap it out for an actual static mesh of a grappling hook that you get online or whatever, or that you make, you can do that. So in order to get our grappling hook model, we're just going to create one real quick. So let's come up here and go to create, and then shapes, and then we're going to use a sphere. And that will add a sphere to our scene. And then this is a little bit big, so let's actually scale this down by like 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. I think that's what I did in my other video. And so now that we have a sphere that's about the size that we want, this is a little trick you can do. You can go up here to Tools, and then Merge Actors. If you're in an older version of Unreal, I think it's under Tools, Developer Tools, and Merge Actor, if I remember correctly. But anyways, you can find this Merge Actor button up here, and we want to hit that. And then you can just leave all this stuff the same and hit Merge Actors. And then we want to go to the Content folder, and then inside of Grapple Hook, we're just going to call this SM_Grapple Hook. So what this is doing is it's merging all of the actors that we have selected together into a new, or sorry, not all the actors. Well, yeah, all the actors that we have selected into a new static mesh. And since we only have the one actor selected, which is the sphere, it's just going to kind of like merge that actor into a new static mesh. So it's kind of sort of like a short little way to making a new static mesh. So we'll hit save, and then I don't know why this popped up again. I think we can just close this. And so now we have, if you look at this, now we have a static mesh that's already that size, and we don't have to scale it or anything. So we can delete both of these guys. And then the final one we want to create is the grapple cable. So right click, and then we're going to go to blueprint class up here, and then hit all classes, and we're going to search for cable. So you can see there's this actor called cable actor. So go ahead and select that. And then we're going to call this BP_grapple cable. So if you look at what this is, we'll do more with this later, but this is basically just the little cable part of it, and we're going to make some changes to it so it's not so wobbly like that, but that's what this is. All right, so let's go ahead and start coding things now. So the first thing we need is an input event for when we want to shoot it. So let's go over here to the project settings, so edit project settings, and then scroll down to input. And then we want to go to action mappings here. So hit this little drop down, and we want to add an action mapping for the E key in my case. So when I press E, that will trigger an event to fire the grappling hook. So hit this little plus button here, and we'll call this use grapple. And then if you just select this little button here and then press the key, so I'm going to press E. That didn't work. Press it. Yeah, press it, and then it'll turn orange, and then you can press E, and that will select E here, or you can just search for E or whatever key you want to use from this dropdown. And then we can come back here to our first person example map window and open up our character. So I'm going to click right here. This is our character. And then we want to open up his blueprint. So I'm going to select over here to open that up. And I'm just going to dock this up here at the top. All right, so down here, let's right click and search for that event we just added. So use grapple. And there it is. So let's go ahead and add that. So this is going to get called whenever we press that E key. So what we want to do is, or the logic here is basically, if the grappling hook is currently being used, then we want to cancel it. And if it's not currently being used, then we want to fire it. So let's go ahead and add this grapple component to our character first of all. So we'll add the grapple component like so. So you just click this little add button and then add it. And so let's go ahead and drag this guy in. And so we want to be able to check if the grappling hook is currently in use. So we're going to need to get that information from our grapple component. So let's go inside of the grapple component and write that functionality. So let's go over here and then open up our grapple component. And then let's just delete these for now because we'll add those back as needed, but no point having them right now. And then let's add a new variable first of all. So let's add a new variable, and we're going to call it the grapple state. So this is what I was creating that enum for. So it's going to keep track of what the state is of the grapple, and that's going to allow us to know whether or not it's currently in use. And then let's change the type of it to E grapple state. And then we can make this guy private since we don't want anybody outside of this class having access to this. File save. And then let's make a function up here. So hit this little plus button and we'll call it is in use question mark. And we can make this guy pure and const. If you don't know what pure and const do, I'll just explain them real quick. So pure just makes it so that, well, I'll just show you. So this is a pure function right here. It's green. And basically every time you drag off of this, it calls the function again. And you don't have to have execution pins hooked up. And then this is a non-pure function, so it's the blue one, and you can see it has execution pins going into it. So the main difference between pure and non-pure functions is, or the important difference is that pure functions like this one, every time you drag off this pin, it will re-evaluate this function and recall this function. Whereas this guy, as soon as it calls it, like all the return values are set in stone. So no matter how many times you drag off the return values, they're just going to be cached, and it's not going to recall this whole function again. And then const functions just mean that they're not going to change anything about the class. So a const function, I couldn't come in here and say set inside of a const function. It'd say, hey, you can't do that because this function is const and it's telling the system that it's not going to make any changes. So that's why we're doing those two checkboxes, because it's just a very simple accessor. So we're going to say is in use, and then we'll drag this grapple state in and say get, and then we'll drag off this and use the select node. Make sure you get this like yellow one here. And we want this function to return a Boolean, so we'll add an output parameter for a Boolean, and we'll call this just result, I guess. And then we can take this wildcard pin and drag it into the result, and that will update to the select to all be using Booleans. And so what we're saying here is if the grappling state is in the ready to fire mode, then it is not in use, so we're going to leave this as false. But if it's firing or if it's attached to a target, then we're going to consider it as in use, and so we're going to return true. So that's what that's doing. And so now we can come back, make sure you compile and save this guy. Now we can come back to our first person character. We can drag up this guy and say is in use. And you'll notice it's green, just like this guy up here, and that's because we made it pure. And then we can do a branch. Okay, so like I was saying before, if it is in use, then we just want to go ahead and cancel it. And if it's not in use, then we want to go ahead and fire it. So we need to write two more functions inside of the grapple component for canceling it and for using it. So let's go back to our grapple component. And then let's see here. On the left, let's add another two functions. We'll add one called fire grapple. And this one is going to take in the target location. So we'll add a little input parameter, make it a vector since it's a location, and we'll just call it target location. And then if we're also going to take in another vector, and it's going to be called the local offset. So what this local offset is basically how far from the center of the screen we want the grappling hook to spawn at. Because if you notice here, when I spawn the grappling hook, it doesn't actually come out of the center of my screen. It comes out kind of from the bottom left. So that's what that offset lets you control, is kind of where it comes from. Because if it came right out the middle of the screen, it would look really weird because you'd kind of be like inside of the cable. So that's why we need that. And then also we want one more for cancel. So add another one and say cancel grapple. And then for this one, we don't really need any parameters. All right, so let's go back and hook these guys up, and then we'll finish writing them. So back over here in our first person character. So if the grappling hook is in use, then we want to cancel it. So we'll drag in our grapple component, and we'll say cancel grapple. Pretty straightforward. And if it is not in use, then we want to go ahead and fire it. So we'll drag this guy, and we'll say fire grapple, like so. All right, so we need to figure out what to pass in here for our target location and our local offset. So the way I have this working, which I think is probably a pretty good way, so the target location, what it does is it actually does a line trace. So that way it ends up going to whatever you're looking at. So you can see, you look at my little red aimer here and I press the button, the little sphere goes exactly to where my aimer is. And so in order to get that to happen, we need to do a couple things. So first of all, we need to actually move our reticle, because by default, that little red reticle is not actually in the center of the screen. Couldn't really tell you why Epic decided to do it that way. because it messes up a bunch of people, but we can go ahead and fix that real quick. So let's go back here to the content folder, search for HUD, open this guy up. If you already have your own HUD, then don't worry about this because you probably have it set up correctly. But you can see what they do is they add a offset so that it looks like the little spheres that are shooting out of the gun here. You see, they just moved it so that it looks more aligned, which is a really hacky, stupid way to do things. The better solution would be to make the spheres actually go to the correct center of the screen. So we're going to delete this so that it's actually in the middle. And then we also need to subtract 8. And the reason we need to subtract 8 is because it's rendering the width of this crosshair as a 16 by 16 image on the screen. So if we subtract 8, or move it 8 to the left and move it 8 up, then it will actually be centered in the middle of the screen. So we're going to do subtract here, and we want to say 8, and we're going to copy paste that guy like so. All right, so this is what it should look like. And then you'll notice, well, you probably can't tell, but now the crosshair is actually in the center of the screen, like exactly in the center of the screen. So we want to make sure that's set up so that way when we actually do the code that fires the bullet, it will go to where the crosshair is, because we're going to set it up to go to the middle of the screen. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is figure out where we're looking at. So for that, we're going to do a very simple line trace. So let's actually move this guy over a little bit. And then down here, we're going to do a line trace by channel, this guy. And we're going to start from the camera's location. So we're going to drag in our camera, which is the first person camera here. And we're going to say get world location. So this is the location of the camera. That's going to be our start. And then our end is going to be our start location plus some value. So we're going to say vector. Oh, sorry, they changed it in Unreal Engine 5. You can't do that. You have to say add now. And then that's going to add a vector. And so the vector we want to add is going to be some amount of distance in the forward direction of the camera. So we're going to say get forward vector. So this is the direction that the camera is facing. And let's move this over a little bit more. And then we want to multiply this. So we're going to type multiply here. Now, if you're using an older version, you can type multiply float and that will pop it up. But if you're using Unreal Engine 5, they've changed it so there's just one multiply. So you have to select this guy and then you have to right click on this pin here and say convert to a float. And then that will give you the ability to multiply a vector by a float. And so this is just essentially the distance we want this line trace to go. So it doesn't really matter too much what you put here as long as it's some big number because, well, it really doesn't matter because as long as it's longer than the actual distance of the grapple, which we're going to set later, then it's fine. So we're just going to use 10,000, which is plenty long enough. And we're going to hook that up to here, and that's going to be our end location. And then I think that's all we need to do. But what we can do here is we can say draw for duration, just so we can see what it's doing. And then once we have that, well, let's just go ahead and run this real quick. So let's actually hook this guy up to the false here. So if it's not in use, we're just going to do this line trace, just so we can make sure we got the math right and the cursor correct. So if we press our E key, you can see it draws a line from our camera's center location to the exact center of our cursor. The reason it kind of looks like a triangle is because it's a quad that's inside of a wall, but it's going directly to the center. So that's good. So make sure that works. And so what we want to do is we want to take this collision point and tell the grappling component that that is our target location. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this out vector, or this out structure, which has information about the line trace, and we're going to break it so that we can get access to all the components in it. Drop this guy down. And so this is the one we want here. So this is the location that the line trace hit. So we could just pass this in as the target, but in the event that this line trace doesn't actually hit anything, like if we're looking straight up in the sky, then this location is going to be, I think it's going to be 0, 0, 0, but it's basically going to be garbage values that we don't care about. So what we actually want to do here, instead of just using this, we want to drag off of the return value. So this is a return value that tells us whether or not the line trace actually hits something. And we want to do that select again. and make sure you get this yellow one here. And so what we're saying is if the line trace hits something, then let's go ahead and use that location. So that's going to go into the true. But if it did not hit something, let's just use the trace in location. So the trace in location is going to be all the way at the end of the line trace, wherever that happens to be. It's going to be based on this value. So it's going to be 10,000 units away from the camera. So it's going to be way down there in the distance. But if we don't hit anything, we don't really care. That's fine. That'll make it so that the line trace still goes in the correct direction. So that's going to be our target location. And then for the local offset, we'll just go ahead and fill in some values here for right now, even though it's not going to do anything yet. So I used 30 backwards, so it's a little bit behind the camera, and I used, or sorry, yeah, negative 30, and then 50. So that makes it kind of behind us, to the left, and up a little bit. Because you got to remember, this is from our origin location. All right, so let's go ahead and give this a try again. Actually, nothing's really should change. So you can see if we fire up in the sky, we're not getting that little red circle at the end, or that little red square at the end, and that's because it's not hitting anything. But you still should get it if you shoot at a wall. So really nothing should be different since now and the last time we ran it. So we need to actually go in here and write this fire grapple function. All right, so let's double click on this guy. And then the first thing we want to do inside of here is we want to make sure that the grapple is in a valid state to be fired. So I know we checked it out here using this is in use function, but it's definitely not going to hurt anything to also check it inside of here. So we can just say if it is in use, and we want to make sure it's not in use, so we'll say not boolean, and then we'll add a branch. A shortcut for adding a branch is if you hold down the B key and left click, it will add a branch node. That's how I'm doing that, by the way. So if it's not already in use, then we want to set the grappling state to firing. So we'll drag this guy in, say set, and we want to select firing because we're basically saying, okay, now the grapple is firing. And then the next thing we want to do is calculate the direction that we want the grapple to go in. So we're going to need to write a little bit of math to figure that out. So what we want to do is we want to take this target location because we know this is where we want it to eventually end up. So we're going to take that location. So we're just going to right click, say get target location, and we want to subtract that from the starting location. So we'll say vector, or I forgot because Unreal Engine 5, so Unreal Engine 4 you can say vector minus vector, you can just type that and it'll pop up. But for 5, it's all just in the subtract node now. And so we'll do vector minus vector here, and then what we want to do is we want to make a, well, I made a macro for this, but let's just write it outside the macro and then we'll add it to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this local offset here, because this is where it's starting at. So we'll say get local offset. And we want to take this value and we want to transform it by the transform of the player. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to make sure that this local offset is obviously in local space. If we don't transform it by the transform of the player, then it's going to be in world space and it's not going to make sense. Because you'll notice if I run this here and when I shoot it, you can see it comes out from the bottom left. And if I turn around, it still comes out from the bottom left. And that's because I'm transforming that local offset so that it's relative to the actual character. So to do that, we can say get owner, and we want to get transform, or get actor transform rather. So this get owner node, by the way, this is the player in this case, because remember we're inside of the grapple component, and so the owner of the grapple component is just the player. So that's all this is. This is just the player's transform. And we'll say transform direction, and we'll pass in this guy. So now this offset is basically has been transformed into the correct world space position relative to the player. And so we want to take this new offset and add it to the actor's location. And that's going to be where it starts from. Because remember, this is an offset from the actor's location. So we'll say get owner again, which is the player. And we'll say get actor location, like this. And we just want to add these two guys together. So we'll say add, like that. and then this is going to go into here. So again, just to recap, all we're doing here is we're taking the target location and subtracting it from the starting location of where we want the grapple hook to spawn. And when we subtract two vectors, we get a vector that goes from the bottom part of the subtraction to the top part of the subtraction. This is going to give us a vector in the direction of the target. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to take part of this and collapse it to a macro because we're going to be reusing this code later, and that way we won't have to retype it. So we're going to take all of this except for this guy. So these nodes right here, make sure you get this right, just these nodes. And then right click and say collapse to macro, like that. And then over here, it will create a macro for us, and we're going to call this the to grapple hook. This is a vector to the grappling hook, if that makes sense. And then let's just open this up real quick. So you can see it added this pin for us here. Let's actually change this name to be local offset, since that's what it is in our case, but it should look just like this. So it's just taking that code, takes in a local offset, and it returns the direction to the grappling hook. So now we can come back here to fire grapple. So now we have this code here. So again, this is the direction to the grapple hook. So we want to normalize this. And the reason we're normalizing this is because, well, currently it's unnormalized. If you don't know what normalizing a vector means, it just means you're making the length of the vector 1, or in other words, you're making it a unit vector. And that's really important when you're dealing with linear algebra, because whenever you're doing calculations on vectors, they normally need to be in normally need to be unit vectors, or else it's going to mess up the calculations. Because a direction doesn't have a distance, right? Like a direction is just north, south, east, west, whatever. So when you're dealing with directions, you want to make sure that the vectors are all unit length. Otherwise, it's going to mess up any of the math. So we have it normalized, and we can take this and we want to make this a local variable. So promote to local variable. And this is now going to be called our fire direction. So this is the actual direction we're going to fire it in. Let me see here. Where am I? Okay, so the next thing we want to do is spawn the actual grappling hook actor. So right click and say spawn actor from class. And then the actor we want to spawn is the BP grapple hook. Make sure you select grapple hook here, not the cable. And then for the transform, we can split this guy up into 3 different nodes here just by right clicking on it. And so the starting location is going to be, let's see here. What did I do on my other one? Oh wait, did I do? Oh, sorry, wait, I named this wrong. Sorry. So this to grapple hook, this is actually, I got confused when I was looking at my other project. So this should actually be called, click on this guy, it should actually be called the cable start location. Because it's not actually a vector to the grappling hook. It's really the start location of the cable. So sorry about that. So this is the cable start location. So we can take that value and pass it in for here as well. And then make sure you also hook up the local offset. So we'll say get local offset. So that's where we want the actual grappling hook to spawn, obviously. And then we also need to specify how fast we want it to go and how far we want it to go. So those are going to be variables of the grappling hook itself. So we'll have to modify this here in a second. Let me just see here. So I think we can go ahead and just test this real quick at least. So if I press play, and then I'm going to press E. Let's see, did it spawn? No. Oh, that's because we didn't actually create this guy yet, or we didn't actually add it to him. So let's open up the grapple hook guy real quick. You can just hit that little magnifying glass and then come down here. So what we want to do is add our static mesh that we created. So hit this plus button and add a new static mesh, like so. And then we can just take this guy and actually drag it on top of the default scene root and replace it, since we don't need that. And then in the static mesh dropdown over here, we can search for our grapple hook static mesh that we created. And there we go. So now it adds a little sphere there. And then while we're here, while we have the static mesh selected, let's come over here and search for collision, because we want to make sure that this thing only collides with things we want it to collide with. Like, we don't want it to be colliding with the player as soon as he shoots it. That wouldn't be good. So this little drop down here for the collision preset, let's change this to ignore only pawns. So that way it ignores only the pawn, which is the player, and other pawns, but it's going to hit things like walls and floors and ceilings and stuff like that. All right, so let's give this a try now. So we hit play, and then we press E. You can see if I back up after I press E, a sphere is kind of spawned to my bottom left. So I'm going to press it, back up a little bit. Oh wait, we can only do it once because of the states thing. So you play it, press E, back up, and you should get a little sphere spawning kind of at the bottom left of your character. So make sure that is happening correctly. And then let's get back to it. So let's see here. Actually, let's go back to our grapple hook, because we need to be able to specify the velocity of this thing and how far we want it to go. And we also want it to actually shoot, right, like a projectile would. So in order to get that, let's add a component, and we're going to be adding the projectile movement component. And so click on this guy, and then let me remember what I did. So sorry, let me check my other project. So in the details, we probably want to turn off the gravity. So this is kind of up to you. So if you want the grapple hook to kind of come out at an arch, then you would want to leave on the gravity, or maybe just lessen it a little bit. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to turn off the gravity so that the grappling hook goes like perfectly straight. And then I think that's the only thing I changed about this, probably. I think it is. So make sure you turn that off or set it to whatever you want. But the important thing here is we need to set the velocity of the projectile movement component so that it actually goes somewhere. So we can delete these guys back in the event graph. And in the begin play, we want to set the velocity of the projectile movement. So we'll drag this guy in and say set velocity. And so here we can set this to be whatever we want. But obviously this is going to change based on which way you're looking. So we want to take this value and have it be a variable that can be passed in to the grappling hook whenever it's created. So let's just take this and right click, promote to variable, and it's going to call it velocity. That's actually perfect. And we want to make sure we say, well, the important one here is expose on spawn. So we can't do expose on spawn unless we have instance editable. Otherwise it will give us a warning. So we want to select both of these. And then we can also make this blueprint read only, so that way it won't change after runtime. And we can also make it private because nobody else needs access to it. So that's what that does. And then I think that should be good. And so now let's come back, or let's actually add, now we'll add it later. So let's come back to our our grapple component. And if we right click on this and say refresh, we'll now see the velocity variable exposed on spawn, just like we wanted. And so now we just need to figure out this velocity. So velocity is two things, right? It's a direction and it's also a speed. So the speed, we can just have it as some hard-coded value of like 1,000 or whatever. But the velocity, or sorry, the direction side of it is going to change based on which way we're looking. So that's why we have this fire direction variable. So we can take this in because this is the direction that we're firing in. And so in order to convert a direction to a velocity, we just need to multiply it by the speed. So we can say multiply, and then again, we need to right click here and convert this to a float since it's a float multiply. And so whatever number we put here is going to essentially be the speed of it. So if you want to make this a variable, you can just by right clicking, promote to variable. And you can just call this like speed, for example. And then we can make this blueprint read only in private since we don't need anybody else accessing it. And then we'll just give this a compile, and then we'll set the default value to whatever we want. So I used 5,000 in my other project, so I'm just going to keep it as 5,000, but you can set it to whatever you want. You could even make this expose on spawn if you wanted this to be something, or you could even have this be passed into the fire grapple function if you wanted it to be like different per shot or something like that. But whatever you want to do for the speed is just passed in here. And that's going to go into our velocity. All right, so now let's give this a try. So now when we play the game and we fire it, it should actually fire out the grappling hook in a straight line. So let's go ahead and try this, press E, and there we go. So now it's firing off our grappling hook. It's only going to happen once, and that's because we have those checks in there to make sure it's in the correct state. And you can't do it again because it thinks it's already fired, which is good. But eventually we'll resolve all this. So make sure you're at this point and it's working, where you can press E and it fires the little sphere in whatever direction you're looking in. Yeah, so I think we'll continue in part 2. So I'll see you guys in part 2.